Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IEEE Global Webinar for the announcement of Ethically Aligned Design, First Edition, a vision for prioritizing human well-being with autonomous and intelligent systems. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Karen McCabe, and I'm with the IEEE. So let's get started. It's my great privilege to introduce the IEEE's Executive Director and CEO, Steve Welby, for opening remarks. Over to you, Steve.
Well, thank you. On behalf of IEEE, the world's largest organization of technical professionals, and the IEEE Standards Association, I'm excited to be here today to participate in the formal release of Ethically Aligned Design First Edition. IEEE is a global, volunteer-driven, nonprofit organization with a membership made up of over 420,000 engineers, computer scientists, and technologists operating in over 160 countries, all organized around the mission of advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. 3 years ago, IEEE established a global initiative on the ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems with the intent to help build a community of global thought leaders and experts to examine the impact of emerging technologies at the convergence of data-intensive systems, machine learning, artificial intelligence, robotics, and the related technical areas, and to discuss the impact and implications of these technologies in the context of best development practice, of emerging policy, of issues of data privacy and agency, and to engage on topics of ethics, regulation, and law, and to consider the implication of all of these technologies on human well-being. Today, the global initiative groups have grown to include over 2,100 members, and over 400 experts played a direct role in drafting the final document we are releasing today. Prior consultation drafts of this document have been previously released to the public for comment and feedback, and this public input has been very valuable in informing and shaping the first edition being released today. Our goal in developing and sharing Ethically Aligned Design First Edition is to help inform the public about the opportunities and the challenges associated with the emerging technical areas of autonomous intelligent systems, and to inspire an audience and readership of academics, engineers, policymakers, and especially to engage the builders and users of autonomous and intelligent systems to discuss, debate, and shape the trajectory of the development and deployment of these capabilities. The focus of Ethically Aligned Design First Edition is to bridge from principles to practice, moving from discussion and debate around ethical design principles for autonomous intelligent systems to a sharpened focus on practical guidelines and practical actions that developers, users, and policymakers can deploy in the real world. IEEE is continuing to expand on these principles in our ongoing work in developing technical standards for intelligent systems, in our ongoing work on tech ethics, in our communities focused on advancing the state-of-the-art in machine learning, robotics, and related fields, and in our ongoing efforts to help educate and inform policymakers around the world. I want to take a moment this morning to thank the many volunteers that contributed their time, energy, and expertise to help build a community focused on exploring and shaping our technological future. I hope that the body of work reflected in Ethically Aligned Design First Edition is a useful step in advancing and informing the public discussion around ethics and technology. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Now to Raja. Raja?
Hello everyone. My name is Raja Shatila. I'm professor at Sorbonne University in Paris, the Institute of Intelligent Systems and Robotics. And I have this great honor to chair the global initiative on ethics of autonomous and intelligent systems, under which the Ethically Aligned Design First Edition has been actually produced. Maybe we can skip to the next slide. And John Evans is our moderator, and he is the executive director of the IEEE Global Initiative. John?
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'll be taking over from you in a little while to introduce all of our chairs. But Raj, I'll just say this quick: thank you for being such an amazing chair for the last 3.5 years. And Roger, did you want to speak to this section, or I can? But if you wanted to speak to this section, go ahead, and if not, I can.
Yes. I would like to introduce you, probably several of you know already that actually it's almost exactly 3 years that we have started this. The global initiative was launched in 2016 in April, and over time, over those 3 years, it has grown to about 2,100 participants. We started much less, I can tell you. And the members are spanning across different backgrounds from the private sector, governments, academia, civil society, and also in terms of background, there you have people from intelligent systems, robotics, philosophy, policy, law, social sciences, etc. And the purpose, actually, of this global initiative, the mission, is actually to dig in, to understand, to analyze the issues that are related to the development of those systems, and by this scientific analysis, provide also principles and actionable recommendations to deal with those issues. And the aim is indeed to educate the makers of those technologies, but also to inform the broader public, to inspire the policymakers so that the autonomous and intelligent systems are used actually for the betterment of humanity. So this ethically aligned design document is really a very wide, comprehensive body of work. And it's important to mention that the whole process was iterative, collaborative, based on consensus discussion. And this is the only way actually to have everyone on board, having their say, and having an openness. Everything is known to all the developers, the person who participated in the discussion. Next. The process, actually, if you look at this slide, we follow an approach which stems from pillars, 3 main pillars, really grounding the whole work. And these main pillars are universal human values, stemming from human rights, for example. The second one is, we call it political self-determination data agency, which actually could be agency over data and human autonomy to decide about their own use of our data, but also their own way to deal with autonomous and intelligent systems, and not the other way around. And the third pillar is, of course, that these systems are technical systems, and therefore they should be dependable. Dependable in terms of computer-based systems means that the systems are reliable, safe, that it can evolve over time while providing a service that can justifiably be trusted. And this is really key, that all users of the system, being individual or businesses, trust the system. This is really a central idea. From these pillars, we can define principles, general principles. And we have actually worked very hard to define those principles. And now we have those principles which are human rights, well-being, which means those intelligent and autonomous systems should not infringe on human rights. They should increase human well-being. Data agency, control of your own data. Effectiveness, which means that when they are being used, they are used for a given purpose and they should accomplish this purpose. With transparency, that's the fifth principle. Transparency means many things. It means that the system is based on values that are known and that it's explainable. Of course, transparency doesn't mean that the designer of the system discloses any secret or intellectual property they put in the system, but they have to be transparent on what the system is doing. Accountability follows from the fact that those systems act and have been designed by human beings. So accountability remain with the human beings. Awareness of misuse, we have to reduce maleficence, possible misuse of the system, so they have to be designed in this way. And competence, it means that they have to be used in a way where the operators, the persons who are using them, have the necessary competence. So all this is explained actually in the chapters of the documents. And you have here the titles of those chapters. We start from general principles and we go into classical ethics, well-being, effective computing. Each chapter has been discussed in length by a specific committee. It has been published for a call for information, modified according to reactions and feedback we got, and again, worked again by an editing committee, and now we are converging onto this. And during this webinar, each chapter will be presented by their chairs. Each chapter is organized in terms of issues and recommendations, and this is actually what you will be finding mostly in this document, in addition to additional resources that you can go to. Next. Those are the chapters, so I already mentioned them. I will not remain too long on this slide. However, I would like just to, for example, insist that there are things that are very general, principles and classical ethics, but you have more focused issues, for example, effective computing, policy, or law. So depending on the chapters, you have recommendations, you have issues that are really focused or more global. Next. The main general principles on this is based, again, I mentioned them orally, but here you have them written, so you can also have the full wording of what is in these general principles. The fact that the human right have to be respected, and I'm not going to repeat myself for the sake of time. I think I mentioned this already, and now, John, I will give the ground to you to introduce what's next. Thank you.
Bessie, Raja, thank you so much. And again, thank you for chairing the initiative for the last 3.5 years. It's an honor to work with you. In terms of, if we can go to the next slide, what we're going to be doing for the bulk of the program now is to actually hear from chairs or co-chairs of all of our different committees that are featured in Ethically Aligned Design First Edition. As a reminder, if you would like to ask any questions, please feel free in the IM chat to ask your questions. What we're going to do is we're going to hold off on answering, however, until all of our chapter chairs and co-chairs have spoken for about 6 minutes each, which will take about an hour. And what we'll try to do is answer as many questions, or what we will do is answer as many questions as we can at the end of the show. But if we don't get to them all, what we'll do is we'll take down your questions, and me and the team will make sure to get answers back to you after the show, just because of time. So with that, I'm very honored and excited to introduce our two co-chairs for general principles. I'm not sure if they're both on the phone. I know Mark is. So Mark, I will let you take it over and talk about general principles. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John. And certainly I'm humbled and honored to be in the presence of all these great minds that are working on this incredibly important initiative. So Pete is not able to join today, but he's been a tremendous co-chair. I am the CEO of Precision Autonomy. Our mission is to accelerate the world's safe adoption of autonomous services via insurance and risk management. I've also been lucky enough to be with the initiative for the 3 years that it's been in operation. So, since inception, like many of us who have been in the initiative, we have an opportunity to speak with others about the importance of AIS and moral and ethical boundaries, and we continue to build greater and greater teams and interest in the topic areas. So we've really got some terrific engagement, and frankly are continuing to want to build on that. The EAD first edition represents a major milestone for us in the initiative, but it's certainly not the end, and it's not even the beginning of the end. So we're continuing to seek to build out the individual teams and continue to grow the impact of this initiative. So just as it relates to general principles and the initiative in general, I'll comment quickly to simply say that it's a very difficult topic to get to a set of principles and values associated with ANIS. And we shouldn't be surprised at that, because machines are excellent at sensing the physical environment and thinking about or assessing the Newtonian physics of what happens in our physical environment, but a little less so when it comes to morals, ethics, social norms, law, things of that nature, which is actually quite difficult for individuals to even agree on. And for things that have heavy precedent, such as human rights, where even that was subject to debate during our process. So it's a difficult topic. A lot of the learned norms, which are difficult for people to agree on, are even more difficult for us to imbue into ANIS. So it's a terrific opportunity for us to come together as a community to try to drive this forward. A couple other just introductory points I wanted to make was that when we think about across the initiative, both the general principles as well as the impacts, it's really in every type of environment, right? So we think about the real world that we operate in, and let's call that the Newtonian world, a virtual world, right? There's different contextual environments that we operate in and that we know ANIS will operate in, as well as mixed reality environments. So as we start to evaluate what the different impacts could be, it's very important to understand that we are looking across multiple different contexts: real, virtual, contextual, mixed reality. That's an incredibly important concept, because it's not a simple topic. And then the other thing I want to comment on before I go any further is simply the vocabulary, which you'll see both in guiding principles or general principles, as well as throughout the document, is a concept of creators. So we've had a concept of creators of ANIS as well as operators of ANIS. And there's also a third category, which is owners. And that those different roles become very, very important when we think about general principles and basically how they should guide our decisions as it relates to the design of ANIS. So what I'll try to do now is just talk quickly about some of the individual, and you've seen them written here. And Raja was kind enough to take us through the discussion of universal human values, political self-determination and data agency, and technical dependability as the pillars that each of the principles roll up to. But I'll just go through very quickly the principles themselves. So the first is human rights. And this is perhaps amongst the truths that we all hold to be self-evident. We've had terrific luck in our committee with Niels Tanover, who is a deep expert in this area that's been helping shape the messaging around human rights basically since inception. The second topic is well-being. And this is important for several different reasons, and I don't want to take the thunder away from John and others, but one, the point of well-being is that it's the opportunity for us to grow. And we didn't want, as a set of general principles, to be a list of thou shalt not, right? What it really needs to be is look at the opportunity of ANIS and not simply evaluate what the concerns may be associated with it. So this is an opportunity for flourishing, an opportunity to guide the appropriate behavior, and not just make what we can, but what we should to serve a positive aspiration. So And well-being is both a general principle as well as its own committee. So we'll hear a bit more about that. And obviously very closely linked to the IEEE mission of technology for humanity. The next point around data agency is incredibly important as well, and already touched on. You know, if we evaluate the last 20 years of internet activity, a lot of it's been about harvested data used to enrich, frankly, others that may not be the individual, with some quite notable abuses. And what we're looking at here is the opportunity to give data agency back to the individual. And, and we see a lot of examples of that in the form of new currencies that are allowing individuals to, frankly, take back control of their data and monetize it for themselves, as opposed to the capture of that data on behalf of others. So as it relates to effectiveness, I think there's an easy example of that in the media today around the 737 MAX planes. I mean, we see clearly there's an opportunity here for effectiveness and fit for purpose. I think there's an argument to be made by some of the research that the autonomous systems within those craft may not have been fully tested and may not have been fully fit for purpose. So there's clearly going to be a need around effectiveness and testing that's incredibly important. Next, around transparency, what we see is there's great many examples of ANIS that are making consequential decisions, whether they be about parole or credit and mortgage decisions or other things of that nature, that simply aren't visible to those that are the subjects of those those actions. So it's going to be very important to make sure that there is indeed transparency into what the ANS are doing. And I'd be remiss to not comment on Alan Winfield, who was really one of the was the initial chair of the General Principles Committee, and has been just a terrific joy to work with. He had a great comment around transparency, that if you had, for example, a home healthcare robot, when it acts, you should be able to press a button that says, "Why did you do that?" That is the true nature of transparency, as to how do we assert that the ANIS should actually be able to articulate the decisions that it's making. Accountability is incredibly important as it relates to owners, operators, and creators. Who's accountable? We can think of that from an accident inspection, a legal point of view, insurance investigations. Insurance is where I spend a great deal of my time, but that's an incredibly important area around what, who and what the accountability will be mapped to. The awareness of misuse, perhaps the most obvious or easy example to use there is the Microsoft Tay chatbot. Many of us may remember that after about 16 hours, it took on a persona that was quite different than what was originally intended. So it's massively important that we evaluate what the awareness for misuse could be. With ANIS, it's not just the algorithms, it's not just the rules, it's the data that it ingests. That's what makes it different. That's what makes machine learning different, cognitive computing different in many respects. So it's important that we are aware of that misuse. And competence is the last one. We assert that if somebody is flying a plane, they have to have competence. And if you're operating a dangerous vehicle in any other context, you also have to have competence. So that's the last important aspect. So you'll see that these are all stated as imperatives. I do want to suggest that they apply equally to creators, owners, and operators, and frankly, all of us on the call are a part of that. So thank you to our team, and sorry for going a bit over here.
Hey, Mark, no worries. Obviously, the general principles are foundational, incredibly important. Thanks also for mentioning the amazing Alan Winfield, who, besides being the founding chair, Mark, with you and the team, is also on our executive committee, and just an amazing thought leader in the space, and we're blessed to have him. So thank you, Mark, and to Pete, and to the committee. And now we're going to move on to, oh, by the way, quick couple of things. Some people in the IM chat were wondering if there's slides for the presentations. The answer is no. What we're doing is just featuring the pictures and bios of our chairs, and that way you can just get to know them a little better while they speak. Next we're going to move on to Jared Baisley, who is the chair of the Classical Ethics and AIS Committee. Jared, go ahead.
Thank you, John. I just wanted to start off by saying it was an honor to lead this committee, and it was a journey, and we're all very honored, each of us on the committee, Classical Ethics, to have been a part of that journey. And so the Classical Ethics Committee really explored two areas for this project. First off, we sought to bring kind of a classical foundational Western ethics into the AIS conversation. And so that was a matter of reviewing classical ethics methodologies from really Aristotle onwards, so over 2,000 years worth of, and even more, 2,000 years plus worth of classical ethics. And this included all of the traditional ethical foundations, including everything from deontological ethics to consequential ethics to virtue ethics and more. And so this was really, of course, a foundational section to our research, and we actually devoted 2 sections out of our 3 sections to this area, and that included looking at definitions for classical ethics in AIS research. So kind of the application of traditional definitions of ethics and how they applied to specific research in artificial or autonomous and intelligent systems. And then secondly, we devoted a section to classical ethics for a technical world. And so this section was more a specific case scenario where we looked at how these methodologies could be applied to specific technical aspects. And so I won't go into detail of that, but you're certainly welcome to read the chapter and see how those were applied. And then lastly, and thirdly and lastly, we then explored a very important aspect of not just our chapter, but I think the entire project here, and that was cultural expectations in AIS. And this section really looked at how classical ethics from globally diverse traditions beyond kind of the Greek tradition, how those applied, how those differing ethical traditions impacted cultural views of what AIS should look like. And so we based this research on kind of a recognition that Western ethical traditions often assume a globally viable ethical worldview, and that this presumption has the potential to undermine other intercultural applications of ethical discourse in autonomous and intelligent systems. And so we advocated the idea that as we advance the conversation around ethics in AIS, it becomes absolutely paramount to recognize ethical and cultural foundations outside Western value systems, and of course while maintaining those Western values as well. But the difference, for example, between ethical systems influenced by Greek dualism, which the Western ethics tradition and our Western culture is largely influenced by, but the difference between Greek dualism and ethics, for example, influenced by Shinto-based animism accounts for 2 very different approaches to our relationship with AI. And anybody familiar with the AI work and autonomous and intelligent systems work having come out of Japan, for instance, will recognize this difference, where the former, or the Western ethical tradition, often is encouraged by a fear-based approach all too often, as expressed in, for instance, many of our science fiction movies, where in fact the second approach coming out of Shinto-based animism is very much a relational approach. And so you have 2 completely different approaches to autonomous and intelligent systems, and it's important to recognize the foundations of those different approaches. And it's important to know that with understanding there are in fact commonalities, as different as our approaches may be, and these commonalities are often expressed in different ways, but also relatable and bridgeable. And so really the ultimate goal of the classical ethics chapter, specifically in bringing our principles to practice, is to look at techniques of embedding these commonalities in autonomous and intelligent systems, really by appropriately interpreting and then reflecting those expressions of culture in AIS, and bridging the differences and acknowledging the commonalities in those differences. And so I will leave it at that, and I would highly encourage everyone to explore the classical ethics chapter. Like I said, it was an honor to lead this group. I could thank everybody by name, but I won't, because that would be a task in itself. But I did want to just thank my co-chair, who can't be with us, Suraj Hunglajaram from Thailand. His work was foundational. As well, I'd like to thank Rachel Fisher, also on our committee, from the African Center for Excellence in Information Ethics. Her assistance and work was also foundational to the success of this chapter. And with that also, just a general thank you to every member of our classical ethics chapter. It was an honor to work with you over the last 3 years, and I look forward to the journey as we continue this research. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared. And this is John again, and I just want to say a huge thank you and a shout out to you and the committee. All the chapters are my favorite, although I'm not objective as executive director, but I love talking about the classical ethics chapter in terms of it really reflects IEEE being global. And also you've done such great work with Suraj and the team in terms of helping readers understand how non-Western ethical traditions can complement Western ethical traditions to advance technology for humanity. So just a huge shout out to you, because that chapter is something that really brings a new perspective, as it did in version 2 in here. So anyway, Jared, thanks so much. Before we get to Laura, Joanna Bryson had a great idea. If anyone's listening, you can now get the Ethically Aligned Design First Edition. You can download it. So although we don't want to distract you from listening here, I'll put the URL where you can get the free Creative Commons copy of Ethically Aligned Design First Edition. And you can download that, and you can actually follow along. Joanna, thank you for that idea. I'll put that up in the IM chat in a moment. Now I'm very honored and thrilled to introduce my dear friend and co-chair for the Wellbeing Committee, Laura Muzikansky, the Executive Director of the Happiness Alliance. Laura, are you there?
Yeah, hi, John. I just want to say first, thank you so much, John, for the work that you have done to bring all of this to the forefront for IEEE and for the world, and also to congratulate the 182 participants for the brilliance of attending this webinar, because I think this work really is beyond cutting edge. It's going to help form our future. So I'm really deeply grateful to be a part of this, and specifically to John, who's always so gracious to everybody. I just want to give really deep gratitude to you, John. The well-being section has 2 parts. The first part defines and explains well-being, and then the second part explores the implementation of well-being metrics for AIS. In defining well-being, our committee took an expansive definition that spans personal, social, economic, and environmental factors. So we went truly beyond GDP, or GDP and beyond. And so what this means is that when you think about well-being in the context of AIS, where AIS will be a part of everything we do, so is well-being. For example, our definition of well-being encompasses our sense of community, and AIS, as we already know, is affecting how we define and interact in community. Our definition encompasses ecological sustainability, and we can say that many in the environmental field have great hope for technological solutions to the problems of sustainable development and climate change. Our definition also encompasses the government and the ability to meet one's needs, as well as protecting human rights. Here I'll quote Agenda 19, in that a human rights framework should represent the floor and not the ceiling for the standards to which AIS creators must adhere. Suffice to say that human well-being encompasses many elements, just as being a human does, and AIS will impact all of these elements in one way or another. So this brings us to our second section, which calls for AIS creators to embed the goals and measures of human well-being into all of their work. AIS creators are asked to engage stakeholders in how they define well-being. And last, we ask AIS creators to look to models and to take special heed to issues of labor, transparency, civil liberties, fairness, ethics, health, security, and other issues. In conclusion, this section provides 2 tools that you can use right now. So if you go and download that document, as John said, you'll have a link to the state of well-being metrics. And this is essentially a primer on the happiness and well-being movement in terms of the metrics, which is the basis for the happiness and well-being movement. You'll also be able to download the happiness screening tool for business product decisions. Now, this tool is based on the country of Bhutan's gross national happiness, often termed G&H screening tool, used by governments for every single policy that they promulgate. So that's a little bit about the well-being section. And John and I were co-chairs. So John, you want to go ahead and fill people in a little more, that would be great.
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all. Laura, being a thought leader in the space globally, it's just been such a huge help for the committee, certainly for me. One thing, Laura, since you were so fast, which is awesome, thank you. You improved my well-being as a moderator. I wanted to also mention that ethically aligned design actually inspired the creation of 14 standards working groups. And a standard working group is means it's the standard is in production. Laura is actually chair of IEEE P7010. The series of standards is called the P7000 series. And Alan Winfield is chair of P7001. I'm going to actually put in the IM chat right now a link to the standards working groups. They are open. Anyone can join. You don't have to be an IEEE member. Of course, if you want to join, that's great. But the point being, they're free. And we would love to help you, rather to have you help us and any of the people working in those amazing working groups to really move from principles to practice with areas like we're talking about today, transparency for 7001, algorithmic bias issues for 7003, and Laura is chair and I'm vice chair of 7010, focused on well-being. Laura, I think the main thing I would say in closing, unless you have any other final thoughts, is that we have this amazing committee that put together the chapter, and kudos to you and the members because it's a really in-depth and tight chapter, and we really catered it or wrote it for the AIS creators to let them see how this sort of triple bottom line or holistic or sustainable development goal mindset, when you create these amazing technologies, really enhances innovation versus stymies it. Anyway, that's the one thing I wanted to say. Anything else, Laura, you want to say in closing?
No, I just want to say again, thank you, John, for this work that you have brought to the world, and keep working on. You're my superhero. And also, again, to all of the participants, I think it's really wonderful that you're a part of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Laura. You're making me blush, and thank you. But I want to say thank you to all the chairs, all the support that we get from IEEE-SA, certainly all the people on the phone helping make this call happen, Karen McCabe, Tanya, the SA team. And now we'll go on with our next chair. So really honored that Joanna Bryson is on the call with us to talk about effective computing. And Joanna, I'll go right to you. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, great. Okay, so actually, I'm surprised to have been brought in just now because, in fact, affect, which means it's a technical term for sort of emotion but more generally valence, how we feel about things. So it was actually one of the second wave of topics that was brought in. I think possibly because we often think of emotion as sort of the thing AI is getting around. It's the opposite of what people think of as what we need computers for. But I guess it shouldn't be at all surprising that once we brought it in, we realized it was actually core to a lot of the ethical questions that we had. We know that affect is the core of natural intelligence. So it was, the first organizing principles of organisms are excitation and depression, go or no go, stay home and heal. So it's not surprising that we need these kinds of principles also for AI. Let me go through, I'm going to just mention the 5 topic areas. The first one was already covered, although, in terms of the traditional ethics or non-traditional, or what do we would say, classical ethics. The issue of systems working across cultures, because people will feel differently because they do have these different expectations. Our section has some very practical things to think about, like, for example, the impact of eye contact, of personal distance, those kinds of things. So we have some very practical proposals in there to help developers think about what they need to know as they build the systems. So it's a nice bookend to the classical ethics section. The next section is called When Systems Care. And what that means is when there's intimate relations, like intimate sorts of caring, physical intimacy doesn't have to be, sexual. It includes just all kinds of things like cleaning, just privacy, being engaged and really things that affect the well-being in a very direct way of humans. So again, we talked a lot about basically the importance of recognizing these situations and supporting and sustaining them, and the issues of privacy. Then I was sort of surprised that this wound up being, again, it makes sense when you think about it, but nudging has turned into, this is like possibly the biggest AI ethics issue of the moment, is the manipulation of people, especially in democracies, as 1/4 of the planet is voting right now. So we make, again, some very specific recommendations about the kind of manipulations and deception that we may very well need. In medicine, it's very common that doctors have to know when you do and don't tell people things. So it's not a simple thing of, just transparency. As was mentioned at the beginning, transparency is not exposing all your code. Transparency is making things clear when they need to be clear. So one of the things we really dwell on is the importance of consent, that nobody should be manipulated without their knowledge. And then transparency is supporting that, in that it lets people know that you realize that this is a nudge that you signed up for, so that we can make sure that there's ongoing consent, there's an ongoing state of being able to be aware of when you are being manipulated. And again, of course, we can't enforce this globally, but what we can say is that we strongly recommend it becomes law, so that when it can be seen that people were manipulated in ways that they didn't anticipate, where there wasn't sufficient transparency, then corporations that didn't do enough work to block that can be prosecuted. Again, as we already are seeing, but we're trying to help establish good practice on that. So again, very practical ways to apply those principles in terms of regulation and enforcement. Then again, something that was already talked about a little bit earlier, in fact, just now, the incredible importance of not allowing systems to constrain how we feel and how we interact. So how this goes wrong is that you try to help people by building an interface so it helps clarify what they're trying to tell you, or they're trying to tell the system, or whatever. But in so doing and making it easier for people, you also constrain what they can say. And so our core recommendation here is that everyone, whether it's government, whether it's a company, whether it's ordinary interactions, there should always be some way that a person talks directly to a person. Maybe not every day, that might not be the most efficient thing, but there must be a way so that people can recognize, or when they do recognize that they need a little more, that they're being constrained and that they can't flourish in some way, that they can't help the company flourish by finding out what its customer really needs, for example. That in these situations, it's important that the human-to-human pathways are maintained, even though we can use AI to heighten and augment most of the things we're trying to do. And then finally, we talk about maybe what people first thought we were going to talk about, which is systems having their own synthetic emotions. So this happens all the time. I mean, again, it sounds like some kind of magic, but it's not. Just like we have artificial faces and artificial hands, we build things like artificial emotions and even artificial consciousness. And one of the things that, at least in our group, again, with this very practical orientation, we work on is the communication of the fact that these are synthetic emotions, that they are designed, people are responsible for the way that they're built, that has no implications whatsoever for things like legal personhood, and that if it does make sense to have this be opaque. So like if you're watching a movie, you know when you go into a movie theater that you're about to watch fiction, but you become completely emotionally engaged. Similarly, transparency doesn't mean broadcasting the robot is lying the whole time that it's pretending to be happy or sad, but rather it means that if someone starts worrying about whether the enjoyable care they're getting means that the robot is somehow suffering or whatever, that there is a mechanism by which we can discover, and that the transparency is available at some point for those who are interested. So I think that's the very quick whirlwind summary, and I really want to thank my co-chairs, John Sulins, who's really been doing most of the work recently, and Ron Arkin, who did all the work at the beginning, and then he brought me in as a co-chair. So that's been sort of the series of co-chairs.
Awesome, Joanna, thank you so much, and thanks for pointing out John and Ron, just because I have such fond memories of in The Hague when we had our first meeting, and Ron and John were there, and then you were kind enough to join in, and really, really appreciate your time, Joanna. Thank you so much. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. And as a reminder, if you're just joining the webinar now, first of all, welcome. And second of all, what we're doing is we're going through talking to all the chairs and co-chairs of Ethically Aligned Design First Edition. And what we're doing is just showing their bios and photos while they speak, because that way just be faster in terms of what we're doing today. You can download the document in ethicsinAction.IEEE.org. That link is in the IM chat. Next, unless she's joined, and Katrina, if you did join, please say hello. I'm honored to be the co-chair of the Personal Data and Individual Agency chapter with the amazing Katrina Dow, dear friend. She's the founder and CEO of MICO. If you get a chance, check out mico.me. She's a real global thought leader in terms of personal data and agency and identity issues. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cheat a little and read, just because we worked a long time at it, the introduction of the Personal Data and Individual Agency chapter, mainly because it's an easy way for sort of a general listening audience to understand what we mean about this. And that'll probably also take up most of my 5 minutes. So what people don't realize sometimes is that regulations like the GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2018 are helping to improve personal data protection, which is fantastic. But legal compliance is not enough to mitigate the ethical implications and core challenges to human agency embodied by algorithmically driven behavioral tracking or persuasive computing. And the core issue of the issue is one of parity, P-A-R-I-T-Y, parity, which is what we talk about in the chapter. Humans cannot respond on an individual basis to every algorithm tracking their behavior without technological tools supported by policy allowing them to do so. Individuals may provide consent, as we do now, without fully understanding specific terms and conditions agreements, but they're also not equipped to fully recognize how the nuanced use of their data to inform personalized algorithms affects their choices at the risk of eroding their agency. In the chapter, we understand agency as an individual's ability to influence and shape their life trajectory as determined by their cultural and social contexts. Agency in the digital arena enables an individual to make informed decisions where their own terms and conditions can be recognized and honored at an algorithmic level. To strengthen individual agency, governments and organizations are recommended to test and implement technologies and policies that let individuals create, curate, and control their online agency as associated with their identity. Data transactions should be moderated, and case-by-case authorization decisions from the individual should happen as to who can process what personal data for what purpose. So again, I read that because a lot of times with the discussion around personal data, the subject of privacy comes up, which is, of course, incredibly important. And regulations like GDPR are seminal in terms of protecting people's data. But in ways that support business and support policy, tools that are often now called sovereign data tools, one of the easiest ones to understand is smart contracts, simply means that people can exchange data in a peer-to-peer way in ways that they understand better about how they're sharing it. It does not mean that tracking goes away in terms of when you are tracked to improve aspects of your life, meaning with services, et cetera. That's great. But to have a sense of agency, to actually really have an algorithmic level kind of protection that honors your terms and conditions, that's what we're talking about in the chapter. We have 3 sections. I won't go through them now to honor our time, but we have these 3 sections called Create, Curate, and Control, where we actually talk about the tools, the organizations, like the wonderful organization My Data, based in Finland, that we do work with the initiative, and others around the world that are really trying to, or that are creating the ecosystem that can complement the existing infrastructure around data exchange, but also trains individuals that their data is precious, that it represents their identity and who they are. And if we want to have agency, especially as we move into the world of augmented and virtual reality, we really need to start training people about the need to have a personal data agent, as it were, at an algorithmic level, not just protecting your data, but honoring your values and who you are. And so you'll read about that in the chapter. Katrina, as I mentioned, is also chair of IEEE P7006. That's actually focused on creating a standard to help individuals have their own personal AI agent. This does not mean in any way a doppelganger of who they are. It means essentially sort of almost an algorithmic level lawyer representing you and your data. But again, it's not a lawyer as an entity, it's a lawyer as a functionality. The last thing I'll mention in closing is that we are very proud at the end of the chapter to have a section on children's data. That's a huge focus for IEEE-SA. And really, when you talk about these topics, sometimes data issues, they get esoteric, but it can be easy to sort of forget that data represents identity at a very visceral level. And I'm a dad. You know, when you talk to parents about kids and their data, usually the conversations are a little bit more open to protection, but also thinking about their future. Huge shout out to Walter Burrow, who's actually the husband of the amazing Kay Firth Butterfield, who's our vice chair. And Kay, huge shout out to all the work that you've done over the last 3 years to help us be what we are. And also to Marcely Hancock. Marcely is also chair of IEEE P7004, focused on protecting children's data. And really proud that at the end of, as I said, this chapter, Walter and Marcely and others on the committee, including Kay, wrote some amazing stuff about protecting kids' data, because really the future of data is about kids' data. So it's something we're really excited to have in that chapter. Okay, we will move on, and thanks so much. Next, really excited to introduce the amazing Liz Gibbons, who is the chair for AIS for Sustainable Development. Liz, take it away.
Okay, thank you. So the committee which designed the Sustainable Development chapter was global and multidisciplinary. It drew on the expertise of the business community, academics in multiple fields, robotics engineers, and development practitioners. And I'd really like to take this opportunity to thank the subcommittee members for all of their dedicated contributions. So the chapter builds on the framework of the general principles and has as its central premise that to be ethical, AI applications must benefit humanity. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, adopted by 193 nations, serve for this chapter as a proxy measure for defining benefits to humanity. The 17 goals, or SDGs, are meant to be adapted for the conditions of each country of the world, with programs to achieve them designed to, quote, leave no one behind. So this Sustainable Development chapter also addresses inequality between high-income countries and low- and middle-income countries by making recommendations for ensuring that no one gets left behind in the advances that AI can offer humanity. The chapter has 5 sections, each of which provides background information, identifies a central issue, and makes between 10 and 20 practical recommendations to address the issue. The sections are AIS in service to sustainable development for all, equal availability, AIS and employment, which is connected to the SDG Goal 8, education for the AIS age, which is connected to the Goal 4, and AIS for humanitarian action connected to Goal 16. Of course, we have a short time, so I'll just highlight a few of the issues we identified and a sample of the corresponding recommendations for addressing these issues, just to give a taste of how these practical things could be applied. So our first major issue is that the current roadmaps for development and deployment of AI systems are not aligned with or guided by their impact on the most important challenges of humanity, defined in the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, which collectively aspire to create a more equal world of peace, prosperity, planet protection, and human dignity. So among the recommendations for addressing this issue is identifying and experimenting with AIS technologies relevant to the UN goals, such as big data for development needed for agricultural and medical telediagnosis, geographic information systems needed in public service planning, disaster prevention, emergency planning, and disease monitoring, and of course documenting those experiences. We also suggest analyzing the cost of and proposing strategies for publicly providing internet access for all as a means of diminishing the gap in AIS's potential benefit to humanity. And that's particularly between urban and rural populations, be it in high income or low and middle income countries. And finally, amongst the sample that I'm suggesting, we propose integrating the SDG indicators into private sector business strategies so that they actually form part of the key performance indicators, which would go well beyond corporate social responsibility. Another key issue for the chapter is that there's vastly different power structures among and within countries that risk that AIS deployment accelerates rather than reduces inequality in the pursuit of a sustainable future. And it's unclear in the low and middle income countries how they can best implement AIS via existing resources. So we make some suggestions, recommendations to address this. For example, supporting low and middle income countries in the development of their own AIS strategies and a retention or return of their AIS talent to prevent brain drain. We encourage also global standardization and harmonization and open source AIS software, and developing public data sets to facilitate access of people to low and middle income countries to data resources to facilitate their applied research. Issues addressed in other sections of the chapter include how AIS is changing the nature of work, disrupting employment, and that technological change is really happening too fast for existing methods of retraining the workforce, and we offer some proposals of how to close that gap and match the huge change that this is introducing with the capacity of the workforce. And we also assert, related to changes in employment, that so far the analysis of the AIS impact on employment has been too focused on the number and category of jobs affected, whereas more attention should actually be addressed to the complexities of changing task content of jobs. And we give a number of recommendations, including integrating more granulated dynamic mapping of the future jobs, tasks, activities, workplace structures, work habits, and skill space spurned by the AIS revolution in order to synchronize skill development and training programs. So faced with the necessary transitions in the workforce, we also address changes needed in education, where we identify the central issue that education to prepare the future workforce in both high-income and low- and middle-income countries to design ethical applications or to have comparative advantage is either lacking or unevenly available, which risks inequality perpetuated across generations within and between countries. So for this, we make numerous recommendations for improving curricula from preschool to postgraduate levels and for reforming education systems to better meet the needs of the AI age. And finally, we have a short section on AIS for humanitarian action, noting that AIS is contributing to humanitarian action to save lives, alleviate suffering, and maintain human dignity both during and in the aftermath of man-made crises and natural disasters. However, there are ethical concerns with both the collection and use of data during humanitarian emergencies, very serious ones given the context. So as with the previous section, this final section makes recommendations on addressing the issue, among the most important being developing and applying ethical standards for the collection, use, and sharing and disposal of data in fragile settings, and following privacy protection frameworks to ensure the most vulnerable are protected in pressing humanitarian situations. So the chapter is very optimistic about the potential of AIS to benefit humanities and advance the Sustainable Development Goals in high-income and low- and middle-income countries, and we're very hopeful the risks can be managed. So the practical recommendations in this chapter, as in the others of the ethically aligned design, will move us towards realizing that benefit. I hope you'll all enjoy reading the chapter as well as the whole volume of issues on practical application. So thank you all very much.
Liz, thank you so much, and thank you again for the Herculean and amazing work you and the committee did. And forgive me if you mentioned this, I was putting something in the IM chat, also because this was the economics chapter for versions 1 and 2 that, again, the amazing Kay Firth Butterfield started with others, including Raj Mahadvan, who was the original chair of that group. So thank you, because you did such a beautiful job adapting it with all the great feedback, both from version 1 and 2 and with those new perspectives. Okay, next we're going to move on to embedding values into autonomous and intelligent systems. A quick note, the methods chapter, if you're looking in the order of the table of contents, Raj and I are going to address that at the end of everyone else speaking. Raj is the co-chair for that chapter. But right now we'll go over to Francesca Rossi.
Yes, Bertram will start describing the content of our chapter, but you know, Bertram and I are both co-chairs, so I leave it to Bertram to start.
All right, thanks, Francesca. So some of the topics you just heard about focus on embedding ethics in the human process of design and engineering of autonomous systems. But as other speakers have pointed out, we must also think about how to embed ethics in those autonomous systems themselves. The question is how we can build them such that they abide by the values and norms of their surrounding community. That's the topic of our chapter, embedding values into autonomous and intelligent systems. Our committee first met at The Hague in August 2016, and the committee was diverse. We had individuals from about a dozen disciplines and a dozen parts of the world. Pretty early on in our discussion, we agreed that the goal of embedding values in autonomous systems really needs to be translated somehow into something more concrete, something more realistic. It requires embedding norms in a system, because norms are really concrete instructions to act in certain ways and can be built into a computational system. And then the norms as a whole will reflect the community's values, including, of course, global human values. After phone meetings, email discussions, study of the literature, and joint writing and revising, we created the first version of our chapter in early 2017. Then there were more revisions, discussions, and 2 rounds of really valuable feedback from the international community. That got us where we are. The final version you can see in the document launched today. What's worth noting is that there were surprisingly few debates in the group, and that the overall structure and the core themes are really there from the start. I hope you'll get a chance to look more closely at the chapter, but here it is in a nutshell. We propose a 3-pronged approach. First, we need to identify the norms in the specified community in which the autonomous system is to be deployed. Second, we need to computationally implement these structures in ways that heed transparency, minimize bias, and also mitigate failures. And third, we need to carefully and repeatedly evaluate these systems for the adequacy and acceptability of their norm competence. Let me say a few words about the first step, identifying norms. And I'll use a specific example, designing a nurse assistant robot. We need to use multiple methods to document the norms in the specific hospital in which the system is deployed. Surveys, observations, interviews, even experiments, as well as the study of manuals and the layout of the space. All these reflect the norms of this small specific community. All that's necessary to find out really these subtle norm structures within this context and within really the multiple contexts that the robot might find itself in. During rounds, in the break room, in the hallway, in a patient's room, either when the relative is in the room or when the attending physician is present. It's just remarkable how diverse and complex and at the same time well practiced human norms are for even this limited domain of a hospital. But we think it's possible to build systems that learn and abide by these norms. The norms will sometimes clash and sometimes subtly change over time, and the autonomous system also needs to be able to resolve some of these conflicts and sometimes ask a human to help with that. And it needs to learn from feedback and observation. And that's where the second step comes in, how to implement these norm networks in an actual autonomous system. And that's where Francesca Rossi will tell you more.
Yes, so once you have identified the norms suitable for an AI system in the context in which it will be deployed and for the task it will need to tackle, we then need to understand how to technically embed such norms into the system. So 3 issues are important to consider here. First, what are the best techniques to model and embed such norms? Is it better a top-down approach where norms are precisely specified, or a bottom-up approach where norms are learned from human data and behavior? The top-down rule-based approach is transparent and explainable, but not very flexible. On the other hand, a pure bottom-up learning approach is unconstrained and thus could fail to follow some norms. For these reasons, a hybrid approach is worth considering. Second thing, the black box will not be trusted, so we need the AI system to be transparent. This was mentioned in other chapters as well. Transparency may mean different things. It may mean traceability, verifiability, honest design, and intelligibility or explainability. Developers should embed mechanisms to allow for all these forms of transparency. Third issue, AI systems, especially those based on machine learning, may make mistakes and thus violate norms. Multiple strategies to mitigate the chance and magnitude of possible harm should be put in place. Okay, so once norms are built into an AI system, we still need to understand how to evaluate it. So how to verify that indeed the system follows the right norms. Designers and developers need to do their work, knowing that such an evaluation process will take place and that the process will continue also after deployment. Evaluation should keep in mind several things. First, that humans and AI systems tackling the same task in the same community do not necessarily have the same norms. A typical example is a robot worker that is expected to work without regular breaks, like a human being is expected to do. Second, special attention should be given to the presence of possible bias in the AI system that could disadvantage some social groups. Evaluation teams in this respect should be diverse enough to facilitate this analysis. And third, AI systems should also be designed, developed, and documented so as to allow for third-party evaluation, for example, by regulators, ethicists, consumer advocates, post-accident investigators, or society at large, allowing, therefore, for transparency, various evaluation techniques with different strengths, and testing. So the chapter examines and discusses in depth all these issues and provides recommendations to multi-stakeholder teams building an AI system on how to identify, embed, and evaluate norms that are relevant for the ethical behavior of the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca and Bertram. Francesca, I want to apologize. I know that your photo unfortunately didn't get displayed, and also that you're no longer a professor of computer science, but you are still at IBM. So thank you so much, Francesca, for that. And for Bertram, a pleasure to hear from both of you for such an important chapter, part of the book. Okay, next, and we're doing good. We have about 20 minutes left. We have 2 more chapters to go. Just as a reminder, we may not have time for a long Q&A at the end of the session. So please do put any questions you have into the IM chat, and I'll make sure to get your questions to the right chairs so we can get your answers back to you. Also, we had a few people ask if this is being recorded. It is being recorded, and I believe, David, if people registered, we can automatically get people the URL for the recording in about a week or so, but we'll confirm that again at the end of the call. And next, we have Peter S. Brooks, And Mina from the policy chapter. I'm not sure who's talking first. The gentleman, take it away.
Good morning. Thank you, John. Mina and I first want to thank the group of 30 experts that worked diligently during the 3-year tour. These spanned ethics, law, government, policy, technology, industry, many different fields. And as expected, they came from across the globe, making, in fact, scheduling the telecon meetings somewhat challenging. We also want to extend a special recognition to the founding co-chairs of the Policy Committee, Kay Firth Butterfield and Philip Hall. There's one fundamental concept that I'd like to convey to the group, and that is as nations consider creating policies for their applications of AIS, they have to base these policies on an internationally accepted legal framework. You need a very strong foundation and one that nations have already accepted. If you do that, you can then make significant progress. Such a foundation, fortunately, is provided by the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That's the formal title. And it's also known as the Ruggie Principles. The Ruggie Principles, they provide a legal framework for human rights standards, and this is the important aspect, that accounts for the impact of technology on individuals while also addressing the inequalities, discriminatory practices, and unjust distribution of resources. Several business sectors have used these to form some of their business policies, and the committee felt that broadening the support and application of the Ruggie Principles to the field of AIS would be vitally important. And in particular, it would help emphasize the need to make AIS a force for social benefit. Now, that is one of the premier values that I think this global initiative holds dearly. What I'd like to do is go through briefly the 5 main recommendations and point out some of the thinking behind them so you can get sort of a holistic view of what the policy group came up with. And as we go through this, I want you to understand that these are not the specific policy recommendations, but rather guidelines and considerations as nations develop their specific policies. Number 1 says, ensure that AIS support, promote, and enable internationally recognized legal norms. Well, here we're saying use the Ruggie Principles as the basis for the formulation of your policies. The Ruggie Principles have well over 20 different characteristics that they call out, and they're rather comprehensive in terms of protecting rights. It's not just a narrowly scoped set of human rights, but it covers many things. We call out in our work 6 of them. Let me just summarize them. Responsibility, so the duty bearers, the developers and users have an obligation to fulfill all human rights. Accountability, this obliges states, nations, to seek to represent the greater public interest. Participation, by which we mean encourage and support a high degree of participation of all interested parties. Non-discrimination, and that means make non-discrimination, equality, and inclusiveness primary factors of consideration. Empowerment, give the individuals and rights holders the right and ability to claim and exercise their rights. And then corporate responsibility, that the companies bear responsibility to pursue these principles. If you look at them as a whole, what it's saying is that the development of this technology can't be the sole province of the technology developers, but rather all parties, developers, users, policymakers, government officials, and so on, have to work together to come to the, let's just say, the right way of doing it. I'd like to cite a personal experience. Recently, I attended a conference of technology futurists, and one of the principal speakers was there at the founding of the Internet. And this person was now looking back over a long career and said, and I'll just paraphrase, with the remaining time I have left, I want to teach people maybe we should have done it differently. And so you don't want us to be looking at the field of AIS decades from now saying, maybe we should have done it differently. Let me go to briefly the rest of the recommendations. Number 2, develop government expertise in AIS. We make these standard recommendations of facilitate skill development, it's technical, policymaker, government officials, and so on. And that has the obvious initial benefit of helping people have better discourse. But more importantly, if all nations did that and if they pursued sharing agreements, then that's one of the important dynamics in getting a worldwide consideration of the issues that bear on the healthy development of AIS. Number 3, third recommendation, ensure governance and ethics are core components of AIS research, development, and acquisition. Here, too, it's saying don't just develop the technology, but emphasize governance and ethics. In the body of the text, we emphasize the need to develop international standards and measures of the benefit or for the benefit derived from AIS. So it's one thing to talk about it, but if you had standards applied to what it means to be of benefit to humankind for this technology, that's where you can begin to have forceful regulations. The fourth one, create policies for AIS to ensure public safety and responsibility of AIS design. Here, too, we have a set of standard activities, but the punch in our discussion is the emphasis on involving a range of expert stakeholders. So it's not simply as, let's just take the case of aircraft, you have a set of aircraft experts bearing on aircraft safety, but what does it mean to have safe development and governance of AIS? Well, there are many other disciplines, and so the emphasis on getting more disciplines together. Finally, the fifth recommendation, educate the public on the ethical and societal impacts. Here, too, the education is very important. Great potential for backlash or premature rejection of these technologies and backsliding in their acceptance. So the educational component will be vital, and this, too, will require not only national efforts, but international efforts. If I were to sum up the messages in the policy chapter, I would do it as follows. One, as everybody recognizes AIS, it's a worldwide technology. Second, it'll create change in all aspects of life. Therefore, you need to have a strong, internationally accepted foundation for whatever it is you're going to do. What we have advocated is choose a foundation where you have international legal acceptance of the framework of thinking, and you follow that up, as IEEE is doing, with encouraging and fostering international participation because the effects will be felt internationally. Let me turn it over to Mina if he has additional comments to make, and thank you very much.
And Mina, this is John. Hey, Mina, this is John. I'm so sorry to rush you, but if you have about maybe 1 minute, just because we're running late, we need to have the law chapter go too. So sorry, but just want to let you know.
No worries. I was not going to say anything in addition to what Peter has already gone over. I was only going to say that it has been a great honor and a privilege to be co-leading this committee, and I'm very excited to see the outcome of the ethically aligned design, its fruit coming to bear. So excellent work for everyone, and let's keep going. Thank you very much, Peter.
Awesome. And did you guys, forgive me if you said I was checking IMs, Philip Paul, who was the original chair of the policy committee, just want to give a shout out to Phil and to both of you gentlemen. Thank you so much for all your help. Yeah, well, thank you guys. Okay, Nico, we got about 5 minutes. I'm sorry to rush you and John, but law, very important, great way to end up this section. Nico, you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, John. On behalf of John Casey, my co-chair, and myself, first of all, I want to thank our all of our law committee members, and John, you as well, for being such an able leader and resource to us. The law committee sought to answer one question, which is, on what basis should we trust or mistrust AIS deployed in the legal system to advance the functions of the law and the values that animate the law? It's a very challenging question, and I think we're successful in providing a sound answer, contributing to and drawing from the general principles you heard about. Before I discuss the principles, I want to highlight the combination of elements that, in my view, at least makes our work unique in what has been a field of valuable contributions from academic centers and others. First, our scope has been to consider the totality of the legal system: lawmaking, criminal justice, civil justice, and law enforcement, not just one aspect or one application of AIs in the law. Second, our vantage point was primarily that of the citizenry to whom the legal system as an institution is accountable. We didn't take just the vantage point of one actor within the legal system. And third, and I think really importantly, our operating objective was not to create some universal law or try to dictate to lawyers, judges, regulators, other professionals in the legal system how to exercise their profession. Our goal was to equip all these stakeholders with the information they need to make evidence-based decisions within the realms of their responsibility. So in defining trust, we concluded that four principles were constitutive of informed trust, and that these four principles could actually be applied effectively in practice, which is a big theme of our work, enabling principles that actually can be applied in practice. So these are effectiveness, competence, accountability, and transparency. And I'll go through those very quickly in the time I have. Effectiveness, you heard about that before, is really empirical evidence that AI works in the circumstances where it is used. This is especially important in the law because our life and liberty depends on the legal system functioning, but also because AI in the law is very often in the hands of operators like lawyers and others, and therefore you need to assess the combination of the two. There are surprisingly few studies in this domain. The most recent ones I'm aware of are those conducted by US NIST in the field of civil discovery, and those ended in 2011. So one of our recommendations with respect to effectiveness is that many more such studies should be undertaken. The second principle is competence. Again, this is especially important in the law because we need to believe that the combination of AIS and the humans who operate that AIS is actually effective. We have standards of competence in society for everything from pilot to plumbers. Today, we don't have standards of competence for operators of AIS in the law, and one of our recommendations is that a system of accreditations should be developed in this respect, reflecting the stakes of AIS in the law. The third principle is accountability, and you've heard about it. It's an essential component of trust. It's confidence that we can apportion responsibility to the agents who are involved. And one comment I want to make here is I want to distinguish accountability as a factual question, which is what really focused on, as opposed to accountability as a normative question thought of as liability. And finally, the last principle is transparency, which is also an essential component of informed trust. And it's really the confidence that the information required for a human to understand why the system behaves a certain way, that information will be accessible in appropriate circumstances to appropriate stakeholders. So these four principles are, in our view, constitutive of informed trust when it comes to the adoption of AIS in the law. They are individually necessary, collectively sufficient. They can apply in any legal system around the world. They are all evidence-based, and they're really capable of being operationalized. Again, this notion of making sure that we can go from principles to practice. I should add that each of these principles have a role to play, but they won't need to be relied equally. They can be tuned up and down depending on the stakes and the circumstances. And I'll close in maybe the next 15 seconds to say that now that we have this definition of informed trust when it comes to deployment of AIS in the law, the next chapter of our work is very clear and well defined, is to define first what type of information constitutes sound evidence that each principle is duly implemented, and second is defining what standards and accreditations can help institutionalize these principles at the scale of society. Thank you.
Thanks, Nico, and thanks to John, Casey, your amazing co-chair on the committee. I'm going to wrap up this section to let you know that the reason, if you're looking at the table of contents, we didn't speak about methods. One is Raja, who's already here, had the chance to speak at the beginning as chair. His co-chair, the amazing Corinne Kath, couldn't join us, but that section is incredibly important. It's, like a lot of our chapters, transversal in nature, and the methods is really about how to imbue these different design-oriented techniques like value-sensitive design, values-based design, work from people like the amazing Sarah Speakerman, responsible innovation, into all of our work. So please do make sure to check out the methods chapter. Closing up here, I'll just say thank you again to the IEEE Standards Association team, David, Karen McCabe, Tanya, all of the folks who helped us get this going. Some people asked some questions. We will not be able to get to them just because we have about 3 minutes left. So I'll follow up with David. And what I'll do is we'll get all the questions and we'll provide answers to them and then send them out in a way that David can mention in a minute. Also, thanks to Sarah Jordan for being the chair of the glossary committee. We put a link to the glossary in the IM chat. It's an incredibly important part of our work. It's an amazing resource. It's 100 pages on its own. And then want to just say finally a thank you to all of the committee members, the 400 or more people who actually created Ethically Aligned Design First Edition, and the about 2,000 other members of our larger member community, and also the community of the amazing volunteers working in all the IEEE P7000 working groups. Thank you so much for your time, and Karen and David, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, and thank you to all our chairs and co-chairs for giving some brief overviews of the chapters. I know there's significant work in each of those, so I do encourage everyone on the webinar and beyond to download the document at Ethics in Action at IEEE.org. And also, we will, unfortunately, we're not able to get to the questions today, but we'll be posting a summary of those on the site, so we'll be getting that information out shortly as well. And as you see here, ethicsinAction.IEEE.org. This is again the web area that you can go to download the document and learn about the global initiative on autonomous and intelligent systems, as well as other related work under the IEEE umbrella in this technical space. So thank you very much, and we wish everyone a wonderful day and evening in whatever time zone you're in. And again, the questions and answers will be incorporating them onto the website. Thank you.